Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and my apologies about the technical difficulties. My name is Lisa LeBourgeois, and I'm the Director of Cultural Affairs at the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C. I'm so excited to welcome you this afternoon to the Jewish Community Relations Council of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater, Simon Family JCC, Embassy of Israel, and Community Partners' 10th Annual Israel Today series. As the Embassy has been a partner of the Israel Today series for many years, I'm very proud to be introducing our guests this afternoon. With us today for the fourth and final installment of Israel Today in Conversation with the Israel Story podcast is Tidewater's old friend, Mishi Harman, the curly-haired Jerusalemite, co-founder and host of Israel Story. After completing his BA in history from Harvard University, he then received a Harvard-Cambridge scholarship to do a Master of Philosophy at Cambridge University. After 7 long years abroad, Mishi returned home to Jerusalem, where he completed his PhD at Hebrew University. He currently resides in Boston with his wife Federica, their new baby, and their 2 dogs, Nomi and Golda. Next, we have Yochai Maital, the moderator of our conversations the past 4 months, co-founder of the incredible podcast Israel Story, and senior producer. Yochai's work is on the theme of journalism and art, and he is driven by the belief that experiencing life through another's eyes is an essential part of a compassionate society. Yochai currently lives in New York with his wife Daphna, 3 kids, and wakes up every morning dreaming of Tel Aviv, just like I do. And last, but certainly not least, is Professor Emeritus Shlomo Maital, who joined the faculty of Technion Israel Institute of Technology in 1980, after serving as a member of the economics department at Tel Aviv University. He was a visiting professor for 20 years at MIT's Sloan School of Management's Management of Technology Master of Science program, teaching over 1,000 R&D engineers from 40 countries. Journalist, runner, babysitter, and more, Professor Maital is a man of many talents. Thank you to Mishi, Yochai, and Professor Maital for joining our community this afternoon. I have one final quick housekeeping note. Throughout the program, please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Mishi, Yochai, and Professor Maital have a great program planned for us today, but would really love to include your questions and comments in this conversation. And now, without further ado, I pass the virtual mic over to Yochai, Mishi, and Professor Maital. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Yochai. Hi, Mishi.
Hi, Abba. Hi, Abba.
Shlomo.
Great to see you all, and I'm privileged to do this interview and ask you questions that I wanted to ask you for a long time, and now we can do it. So seriously, in the movie Sophie's Choice, Meryl Streep is forced to choose which of her children to save from the Holocaust. That's a tough choice. So Yochai and Mishi, your first episode of Israel Story went live on July 19th, 2013. I guess you remember that, guys. That's 7.5 years ago. And your first English episode went live on August 18th, 2014. So I'm wondering, how many stories have you done so far, roughly? And I'd like to ask each of you in turn, which of all these stories, your children, like Sophie, your children, which is your favorite? And why is it your favorite? Which is your favorite child? Let's start with Mishi.
I was kind of hoping you would start with Yochai with that question. So first of all, thank you for having us, and it's lovely to be here. And in past years, we've had the privilege and honor of being your guests in person, and we hope in the future to be able to come back to Virginia Beach. But this is the next best thing. So thank you, and also thank you, Shlomo, for doing this. I feel we should be interviewing you, since you have things that are more interesting to say than we do, and you'll notice that I assume that both Yochai and I will try to flip it and at some point start interviewing you during this hour. But to answer your question, I think we've probably done hundreds of stories up until now, and in fact, we just released yesterday an episode called Stories We Killed, which is a little taste of the stories that we don't air, because what you hear on our show really represents only a small fraction of the stories that come across our our radars. And in fact, you, Shlomo, are responsible for a lot of the pitches that we come across. As Yochai often says, you pitch him an average of 1.5 stories a day. And in fact, just now in our little pre-conversation, you pitched a story about Lisa. So there's really, I would say, over the years, thousands and thousands of stories that we've considered, and many of the stories that we don't end up airing are stories that we go out and record, and sometimes they get put on the shelf for many years. This season we aired a story that Yochai did about a horse trainer from Nitzarim, who was actually your daughter, Yochai's sister's good friend. And that was a story that Yochai first pitched, I think, in our very first pitch meeting in 2011. And then it actually made it on air almost 10 years later. So as to the question of a favorite story, it's really an almost impossible task to choose, but I won't hide behind that and say that it's impossible. We work so intensely on each one of these stories, so there, almost by default, my favorite story is what I'm currently working on. But I think of all of the stories that we ever did, most of my favorite stories are actually not stories that I myself did, stories that other producers on the team did, that Yochai did. But I think one that sort of always will remain with me is one of the very first stories that we did on the show, which ended up also sort of initiating a decade-long friendship by now, which is this story of this ultra-Orthodox woman who's a serial adopter of Down syndrome, babies with Down syndrome. And I think Yochai and I first went there in 2011 or 2012 to Tzfat, and that woman has since become a part of our life. And every few years we go back to her and check in, interested to hear what you have to say, Yochai, about your favorite story here. But really, I mean, there's such a range. Some stories come together very quickly. Some you work on for years and years. Yochai is probably the champion of that, of working on stories. Sometimes there's stories that Yochai produces for 3 or 4 years till he feels that they're ready, and forms really deep emotional connections with the subjects.
I love the story about the ultra-Orthodox woman who adopted those wonderful children. That was a great story. Yochai, what's your favorite?
I think so. Again, like Mishi says, there's definitely a very, very strong bias towards what I'm working on now. It's sort of it's so all-encompassing working on a story that you just kind of forget anything else exists almost. So definitely, like I'm very proud of actually the most recent story that we did, which is a double episode about one of the really craziest battles of the Yom Kippur War. So one of the opening battles of the Yom Kippur War. But really the main reason I was interested in the story from the get-go was the story of how the combatants following the war had sort of many of them, most of them had pretty severe post-trauma. And they just sort of dispersed. They didn't stay in touch or anything, which made the post-trauma even worse. And it's kind of the story about how they all reconnected many years after the war, many decades after the war, and sort of found solace in their sort of reunion and in finding each other again. And the reason that's like I'm very emotional. Like I'm actually, we've been doing this for a while, so I don't feel the same way about each and every one of my stories. But this one, I don't know. I just felt like I was really inspired by these guys, because they're on the one hand such Israeli stereotypes of like these macho, like lochamim, combatants and warriors and stuff, very gruff. But then on the other hand, they open up about their emotions, about crying at night, and about they really make themselves emotionally available and show their vulnerabilities in a way that really, I don't know, touched me. So that's maybe one thing, and maybe one other story that I just keep thinking about is this a story I did in Hebrew and in English about the central bus station of Tel Aviv, which is a place. The reason I like that story is not because of how it came out. I like how it came out, but my emotional connection to it is that when I set out to do the story, I hated the central bus station and I thought it was the most horrific place in Israel. And doing that story, I see the building in a whole different light. I understand the life in the building. I understand the thinking of the architect behind creating such a weird labyrinth, gigantic building. That, just for people who don't know this, the central bus station of Tel Aviv, until quite recently, was the largest bus station in the world. At the time when it opened, actually, it replaced Port Authority in New York. New Delhi beat it a few years ago, but when it opened, it replaced Port Authority, which doesn't make any sense, of course. But yeah, so that really, I mean, enabled me to see this whole, like, the life behind a building and to see it completely differently. So it changed the way I looked at things, and that's something that often happens, I feel, when working on stories. You get to widen your perspective.
Clearly, when you do stories, you get emotionally attached to the stories, and that, by the way, comes across in what we hear over the airways. So, Yochai and Mishi, I'm a retired professor. It's called emeritus. Emeritus is Latin for over the hill. I'm an over the hill professor. I spent my life researching innovation and creativity, and I write books about it. I'm still doing that. But honestly, I still do not fully grasp the creative process. Many of your stories are truly offbeat, out of the box, as they say, inspired, like spending 24 hours in a pancake house and interviewing everybody who breathes there. I was part of that. I love that. Or going to every one of 54 addresses in Israel, 48 Herzl Street, in 54 places, and interviewing the people that you find there, just knocking on doors. So tell the world, Yochai and Mishi, where do your ideas come from? Is it eureka or perspiration? Let's start with Yochai. How does the creative process work?
I think a lot of the creativity comes from a process of groupthink. So really, from the start, it's always been we've always been really good at brainstorming and at getting together and sort of throwing ideas out. From our first pitch meeting, where Mishi took a big cardboard box, opened it up, and we just started throwing ideas, and we had dozens and dozens of ideas, and only 4 made them into our first episode. And to this day, we do something very similar whenever we have some kind of a dilemma, or we just sort of get everybody together and we throw out as many ideas as possible and bounce them back and forth. And inevitably, the ideas that people throw out lead interesting discussions that lead to more ideas.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe one of the key elements of the process, I think. No, Mish?
Yeah, I think, early on, Shlomo, a lot of those ideas came out of a necessity, which was that we had this, we started a project, and the aim of the project was to explore Israel and to explore sort of the Israel that people don't perhaps know as well. And we had a real problem, which was that we were 4 friends, Yochai and myself and our 2 other dear childhood friends. And as you well know, we were all extremely similar. I mean, we were all friends to begin with. We were all boys. We were all born in 1983. Yochai was sort of the diversity ticket because he was born in December '82. And our parents all had similar jobs, and we really didn't represent any kind of diversity within Israeli society. So a lot of those, that posed a real.
We come from the conservative community, which is also like a very fringy thing in Israel, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those ideas that you just mentioned were early attempts to try and get out of our own little social bubbles and tell stories that were not coming from Jerusalem or from Tel Aviv. And we kept on trying to think of how we can sort of create these interesting cross sections of Israeli society that would allow us to actually go out and explore. So, take the Pancake House, for example. We just chose a random day. We spent exactly 24 hours there. You, I think, took some sort of very, very early morning shift. And when you do such a project, you really have no control whatsoever on who is going to walk through those doors, and you're inevitably going to meet rich people and poor people and young people and old people and Mizrahim and Ashkenazim and right wingers and left wingers and Jews and Arabs and so on and so forth. And today our process has shifted a little bit. We actually want to go back to doing more of those kind of projects. Because they're fun and surprising, and they actually are a moment of creativity. Today, most of our stories come from pitches or from the team or from listeners, and I think we are a little bit more confident than we were early on as to whether people will actually be interested in what still there are moments where we're not certain. I mean, till this day, where we will produce a whole story and then say, like, is anyone going to care? But early on, we really didn't know if anyone was going to care. And I think the trick is to surround ourselves with excellent people who are themselves creative, who are curious about the world. And I think the most important decision that we make on the team always is just who we add to the team.
Yeah. So a small bit of advice, Yochai and Mishi. Often companies, for example, they start as wild startups with wild ideas, and they end up being tamed, like a tamed tiger. Don't be tamed. Keep going for the wild ideas. Don't become too bourgeois, let us say. But you know that.
But
Yochai,
how do you avoid being tamed? That's the question.
by being aware of it, and by being aware that you're becoming tame and you're doing the same thing. Never do the same thing. But it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah,
Yochai.
I think that's something that
Yeah.
by the way, we talked about that this season. We've tried doing a few things that were a little less like our usual sort of shtick, you could say, of sort of narrated stories and stuff like that. But yeah,
Yes.
definitely good advice.
Part of the problem is fear of failure. So never be afraid to fall on your face. Just go for it. Because you got to fail once in a while, or else you're not being really radical and innovative. Yochai, from the time you're a kid, Yochai, you fought for the underdog, for the bullied, for those who are different. I remember that really well. I think you were born with it. So it seemed natural, Yochai, that you would accompany your classmate, Moran, who was abused by her stepfather. She tried to kill herself. She hurt herself, injured herself, was in severe pain, didn't go away. She chose to end her life and do this through Dignitas in Switzerland. And Yochai, she chose you to accompany her on this journey, several trips to Switzerland, including the last one. You documented this very movingly with Moran. Tell us about this somewhat painful episode, Yochai, with Moran.
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, this is a story that aired in Hebrew. Unfortunately, Moran did not speak English, and she passed away. So there's no way to sort of re-interview her anyway. But yeah, as you said, Moran decided. I won't go into the whole story; it's quite complicated. But following long bouts with depression and also with the very severe injuries that she had following failed suicide attempts, she decided to petition the Swiss organization called Dignitas that helps people end their life in a what they call a safe and painless manner. So safe meaning that it doesn't result in further injury or something like that. and she asked me to join her, and she also wanted me to document her story. And it put me in a she really put me on the spot, to be honest, because I didn't know what to do. At first I felt, if I document her story and I go along with it and I go with her to Switzerland and all that stuff, and I even participated in some of her meetings with Dignitas as a translator to help her translate with the organizations. So I'm like complicit in her suicide or something like that, and I really didn't know what to do. And we spent a lot of back and forth actually trying to convince her to try different things. And as time progressed, and I saw how serious she was about her plans. I noticed that basically Moran was always a very loved figure. She was very, very charismatic, a very special person, and she was estranged from her family because her family took the side of the abuser. So she was really alone in the world on the one hand, but on the other hand, she had a lot of friends, a lot of people who loved her. And it was very hard for all of us to hear about her plans, obviously. And bit by bit, she basically cut ties and cut contacts with anybody who would try to dissuade her from doing what she wanted to do. And so it put me in this spot where I had a really hard choice to either be there for her or else accept the fact that she's going that she will cut me off and keep doing what she's doing. So actually, it's interesting. One of the people who we started this show, as Mishi said, 4 friends, and one of them is Shai, and Shai is a very wise person and also a clinical psychologist. So I really felt I contacted Shai and I said, Shai, I need like an accompanying psychologist, not just an editor for this story. And so Shai would send me all kinds of relevant articles, like what do you do in these kind of situations? And we had long conversations. So I felt like I really got this support from our Israel Story team while I was working on this as well, not just editorial support, but much emotional support.
Right.
And I decided to do it, to go with her to Switzerland and support her. So at a certain point, I kind of did a switch and I stopped trying to convince her not to kill herself.
And I gather, Yochai, you're preparing a book based on Moran's writings?
Yeah, so when she passed away, Moran was a prolific writer. She never published anything, but she wrote every day. And when she died, in her will, she left me all of her writing with a request that I publish a book of hers. So it took me a few years, but I did put together a manuscript of a book that is it's her book. I mean, I just edited her words into a book. It was a very challenging task to take thousands and thousands of pages and sort of turn it into a cohesive narrative. And the book was actually supposed to already come out, but Corona happened. So now all the bookstores in Israel are shut down, and all the publishers are also basically shut down. But hopefully that'll happen within the next year.
It's an unusual case, Yochai, because it's a case in which the storyteller becomes part of the story. Unusual.
Yeah, I think that's why I do like, I think Lisa described in the beginning, see what we do as sort of on the scene between journalism and art, and not just journalism.
Yep.
Because journalism, like, sort of like New York Times investigative, like serious journalism, which is, really important and I highly respect, it demands this sort of objectivity. And this objectivity there's something cold about it, because I feel like, Mishi and I, we have very different attitudes, but I think that both of us are the opposite of cold when we come to interview somebody. We try and create a connection to them, and we see ourselves in them, and we love them, essentially. I think the way I see it, if you don't love the characters you're telling the story about, then that to me, when that happens, it's a bit of a red sign. And I ask myself, should I be telling this story? Because essentially, that's what I want the listener to feel. I want him to feel connected, to fall in love with the character. So
Absolutely.
definitely there is an emotional involvement.
So, Mishi, your family is a famous and distinguished one. Your late grandfather, Avraham, he was Israel's third ambassador to the U.S. He was a longtime president of the Hebrew University, an excellent president. I recall him. Your grandmother, your late grandmother, Zina, incredible lady. I know you were very close to Zina. And your dad, professor of education, and your aunt, Naomi Chazan, who was a scholar and a wonderfully productive Knesset member for years. The old school Knesset members, not the kind that we have today. And you yourself have a PhD. So, Mishi, I'm wondering, how does your family relate to your work on Israel's story as a storyteller? What has been their reaction?
I think my mother is extremely concerned, to be honest. Um, one of the things that we were able to do is that we created our own job, really. And that's, I guess, not the path that most people follow. Most people, join an institution or an organization or a company, and we were all doing different things that, when we first started off. But we just had this collective dream, and then it, through a lot of luck and a lot of hard work and a lot of generosity of many people along the way, became a real entity in the world and a workplace. And now, I think one of the things that is that we're all most proud of is that it's a workplace for other people as well. And we're employers, and there's a large team working with us of wonderful people. But I mean, this is very, very far from being a lucrative job. So that is a source of anxiety for my mother. I think that, I think that there, one of the real joys of working on Israel's story, which is probably a joy shared by a lot of journalists and a lot of storytellers, is that there's never a dull moment, and you really are almost every day something surprising happens. And I don't think that in the 10 years or so that we've been working on this project, there's ever been a moment where I've been bored. There are moments that are very difficult. There are moments where you feel stress or whatever, but I don't think that we're ever bored. And that's because, we're telling, we are able to shift between themes and between realms of life relatively quickly. So, take Yochai, for instance. He's been spending the last few months thinking about PTSD, and the last week thinking about a guy who's trying to get sperm from New Jersey to Israel. So I mean, it's really very eclectic, and I think that at the end of the day, what perhaps I hope my family think about this is that it does something important, which is that it allows people around the world to connect to Israel in a way which is not the usual way of thinking through the prism of politics or of religion, but rather of celebrating humanity and showcasing a really diverse population.
So, Mishi and Yochai, the subtitle of this webcast is an intergenerational conversation. Many generations, my parents' generation, and maybe even me myself, for many generations, people did what they had to do to make a living rather than what they really loved. I wanted to be a writer of fiction, but I also wanted to migrate to Israel, and I didn't think I could make a living, so I became, of all things, an economist. You two are doing what you love. And maybe one of the first generations who really can do that. And I've had many students who don't do it and end up regretting it. And I've steered an architect in the direction of working with young children in kindergartens and changed her life, and she was good at it. So carry on, you guys. You're doing good. Do what you love. Keep doing what you love, and that's the right way to go. So now we're going to talk business because I'm a business professor. Unfortunately, you guys, you guys are a startup. Sometimes startups do what we call a pivot. In fact, really great startups always do that. Netflix started off by sending DVDs in the mail to people, and look where they are now. I mean, that is one hell of a pivot. Um, Pivots means taking a new direction, and often an unexpected one. Israel's story pivoted toward live performances. That was pretty unusual because I really don't think of either of you as real performers. And your performances are a mixture of audio and visual and storytelling and music and dance. Very creative. How did this happen that you became performers, live performers? And are you pleased with the result? And do you hope to return to live performances when you can, maybe in the fall?
Hi.
So, I mean, yeah, it's true. I'll say that I think it came about almost by accident. We were asked to participate in an event at the JCC in Manhattan, and it was supposed to be one of those sort of stuffy interview, where people like me and Mishi sit on a couch and somebody will interview us or something like that. And we decided we wanted to do something a little different, and then we sort of put together this live show based on the episode that you mentioned in Hebrew, the Herzl 48 episode, where we went and visited each and every Herzl 48 address in Israel. And so we revisited those addresses up this time with a camera, and we brought a live animator, and we did all kinds of things. I actually, and I remember that I understood why it was a good idea to do this and meet the audience, but I wasn't so excited about it. I mean, I was more anxious about it. I remember the first time I got on stage to tell a story, my voice was noticeably shaking. I really had pretty strong stage fright. I really like the elements of how what we do is sort of like you can edit it, and how everything sort of happens behind the scenes, and you have this full control before you release it, and you can go over it endlessly to make sure everything sounds good. And of course, a live event is the opposite end of the spectrum. But I think it was definitely a game changer for our show, because it let us both reach many new audiences, and also it was very important financially for our organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of this is what I think it's also like this strive to survive that's also keeping us on our toes. What Mishi started talking about it, but basically it's sort of unheard of, at least in Israel, because we're completely independent. So we're set up as an NGO, and we are our own entity. Even though we have affiliation with Tablet Magazine, and in Israel with Galei Tzahal, and our show has been broadcast on NPR stations across the U.S., etc. But we're not officially connected to any one of those things. We are our own platform. We have full control of our content, of who we hire, what we do, and everything. And so the flip side of that, of course, is that we have to maintain that thing. We don't have some bigger organization that's budgeting us or something like that. We have to constantly be working to make ourselves to keep ourselves alive, basically. So it's a constant struggle, and part of that, by the way, I think in terms of pivoting, is also the way. I mean, a big part of our income, of our funding for our show, it used to be live shows, and also these live engagements that me and Mishi would do all over the U.S. and the world, even South Africa and the U.K. and different places where we used to go and talk to people and tell stories. And that's all, of course, evaporated, and we've had to really change the way we think about it. So last Yom Ha'atzmaut, typically our biggest sort of tour, live tour, is on Yom Ha'atzmaut, And so Mishi came up with this idea to basically do like a telethon, like a full day Zoom event where we would basically interview people back to back to back to back throughout the whole day. And we understood that we just, you know, we got this, and somehow we really capitalized on the fact that everybody was stuck at home. So you could really get to, you know, really people that are hard to get to sometimes, really famous people. You interviewed Dan Shechtman, and we got NBA players and Nobel laureates and, you know, big musicians, David Boza and Shannon Street and on, you know. And so that was but we don't know anything about doing like, it was essentially live television, you know. So again, we kind of had to learn the ropes, and it keeps things more interesting, that's for sure.
So, Michigan.
I would just add to that, Shlomo, that in many ways, I think we pivot all the time, but in other ways, what we're actually pivoting is just the format, or sort of the delivery mechanism. At the end of the day, what we're doing in all kinds of different manners is sharing human interest stories. And sometimes it's on the radio, and sometimes it's on the stage with all these elaborate bells and whistles, as you said, and sometimes, you know, it's via Zoom or whatever. And you know, we have plans for future new developments, and that, you know, into other medium as well. But at the end of the day, there's really some commonality to all of this, which is that, you know, we're interested, we're curious about people, we want to tell their stories, we want their stories to be heard, and you know, as Yochai said, a lot of in a startup, a lot of it is about just surviving. So you know, needing to survive is a huge motivator to think of new ways of doing things.
So, guys, I'm 78, and I've been on this earth quite a long time, more than twice the time that you have. But I still want to get some advice from you. So, Michi and Yochai, there's a real art to telling stories. You know, I spent many, many years teaching economics, and an economist crunches numbers. And one day, not that long ago, it took me an awfully long time. I'm pretty dense. I saw the light. You find the truth in stories about people. You don't use in statistics n equals 25,000. You use n equals 1, or n is less than 1, and you tell a real story about real people. And that's how people learn. So share with your participants, and with me especially, what's the secret to telling a great story? A story that touches our hearts and our minds, that educates us, enlightens us, empowers us, a story that we will never forget. For example, tell Saki. What's the secret to telling a great story?
That's a very hard one. I'm gonna stall for a second, just to say to everybody in the audience, if you guys want we're just reminding you that you can use the Q&A option on the bottom to ask some questions of your own. Mish, do you have a good answer for this? I mean, the one thing I do think is that the way I see it, stories are, and also this sort of relates to what Mishi says. I totally agree with what Mishi says. You talked about pivoting and changing, etc. But something about what we do harkens back to sitting around the fire and telling stories. It's ancient, and it's been around, and we haven't invented that, and it's going to stay the same for years. And essentially, that's what Netflix does. You mentioned Netflix, and what we're all doing, telling stories. And the way I look at it is that stories are basically like the software of our brain. The way we make sense of the world, the way we communicate, how we think about the world, the way we talk to each other is essentially through stories. So really, it's the only way to create a connection or to convey ideas. It's always through story. If you're not completely conscious of the fact that that's what you're doing, And unless, I mean, there are exceptions, but those exceptions are like, like Rain Man, or people who are like, there's maybe some kind of a really something very different in the way you think if you don't think at stories. But most of us, that's how we perceive the world, and that's how we also that's the only way we have to sort of break out of our own the solitude of the human solitude of being stuck in your own mind. It's the only way is through stories. It's the only way people can connect to your experience.
Missy, you want to add to that?
I spent a lot of time in my life in lecture halls and universities, and it always struck me that the way that I retained information best was when it was made into a story. And storytelling and stories have become a little bit buzzwords in recent years, but for me, at least, for the way that I think, that is the most that is the clearest way of conveying information. So when and everyone's mind is a little bit different, but I would forget almost all of the facts that I studied in any course or read in any book within a few years of taking the course or reading a book. But I noticed again and again that when it was presented in a story form of people doing things, people thinking things, people having to make choices and stuff like that, suddenly things sort of stuck with me. If I can maybe give one example of that, I once took I didn't know what to study when I was in the university, and my father said, "Well, if you don't know what to study, you should study history, because really history is anything. You can take anything and say that it's a history course." So I took a history course once when I was in my undergrad, and it was a course that sort of introduced you to various different historical writing genres, and we read one book in this course, which is by a journalist called Adam Hochschild, and the book is called King Leopold's Ghost. It's about Leopold in the Congo and the atrocities there in the early 20th century and the rubber craze. And it's written as a novel. It's a history book, but it's very well footnoted and so on and so forth. But it's written as a story. And I remember that story and the various details and scenes from that story more than I remember almost anything else that I read, from all those history books. And I think that there's a certain power to this. I mean, we as Yochai said, I think most of us process the world through these things. Our memories are created as stories, and that's what I enjoy most about our work, because our work has different facets of it. One is sort of that outward one, which is perhaps most noticeable to listeners, which is sort of we produce these stories that end up being aired on the radio and on our podcast, and there's a lot of craft that goes into that, and a lot of editing and music and so on and so forth. But we also get to experience stories, and that's perhaps, I think, my favorite part of this path that we've been on, and on this journey. And I had to go first when you asked what your favorite story is, so I didn't have a lot of time to think. So I sort of said my standard answer. But the truth of the matter is that if I think about it more, I think that my favorite story that I ever did for Israel Story is a story that never aired, and it's my favorite story because I enjoyed being in that story, and my father was in the first delegation of the Scouts, the Israeli Scouts to America in 1960 when he was 16 years old, and the heads of this delegation wanted there to be an Arab member of the delegation, and they found some Arab kid who was 13. Everyone else was 16, but they found this kid from Fahim. He had never left Fahim in his life, and suddenly he was paraded across America, going to various different synagogues and talking about Zionism and about how wonderful the state of Israel is. In any event, my father told me about this. There's a picture of this delegation that my father has in his study, and father told me about this. And many, many years later, obviously nearly 60 years later, I ended up using our network of informants now that we've collected through the show, and I managed to find this gentleman in Fahim. And I called him up and I asked him if I could bring my father, and they hadn't seen each other in nearly 60 years. And it was actually a very underwhelming reunion, which is, I think, why this story never aired. But I enjoyed being part. I mean, that's part of the story of my life now. So
live your story. Live your stories. Good advice. So we're out of time. Yochai, do we have some questions from the audience that you and Missy?
No, I think we covered everything.
So two possibilities. You both are really, really good interviewers with different styles. What should I have asked you that I didn't ask you? What would you ask Yochai and Missy?
Nish, you want to go?
Yochai?
First of all, I say that's yeah, it's funny that you use that trick. It's something that I always ask my interviewees.
That's where I got it, Yochai. Where do you think I got
it? Yeah. I don't know. Maybe not that I have a great answer for this question, but what's next?
That's what I was going to ask you. What's next, Missy and Yochai? What's next?
I mean, I think for me, one thing that I struggle with and I think about a lot, and Yochai and I talk a lot about, is we have this mission of telling stories, these human interest stories, and they explore all kinds of different topics, all kinds of facets of life, and so on and so forth. There's something about it which is, a little bit eclectic. There's something about it which is a little bit random. There's something about it which sort of cherry picks these kind of esoteric topics. And, Israeli society is one which is undergoing significant change. There's much to say about Israeli society, about democracy in Israeli society, about pluralism, about church and state, and so on and so forth. And it's a real question whether our show expands that conversation in a way. That's what we say, that our show expands that conversation. But there's also a real question as to whether our mission sort of ignores real issues in Israeli society, and whether that is I mean, at the end of the day, we're only on this earth for a short amount of time, so you want to make that count, and you wonder, like, well, should we be talking about other things? Should we, we have this sort of very clear non-political stance, which is one that I support and fight for vigorously, but one can wonder whether that is actually the right thing to do. And I think this is something Yochai and I talk about a lot.
So I can answer the question, I think, from my point of view. Don't get too serious, and don't get into that game. The story you did about Hodaya and the white horse told us much more about the settlements, about Gaza, converts. It told us much more about that than any in-depth news reporting or investigative reporting. The so-called oddball stories are really the ones that we really learn from. Just keep up the great work. It's 3 minutes to 8. I think we're out of time. In Israel, it's 3 minutes to 8. It's almost 1 o'clock your time. Yochai, if there are no questions, we'll pass it back to the organizers.
Yeah, I've just been asked by Robert and everybody to wrap it up, so I'll just say a few words. This is the last of a series of 4 events that we've had together. It's been really an amazing opportunity and so fun to be here and do all these events with you guys. Like Mishi said in the beginning, I'm praying and wishing to be back in Virginia in person. And seeing actual people in front of us, that would be so fun. But the fact that our series is finishing does not by any means that the series is finishing. So first of all, of course, I want to thank you all for joining our program, but mainly I want to make sure that you don't miss out the next incredible events that there are the great folks at this for Simon Family JCC are planning. And the next one is actually going to be a conversation with a very inspiring figure. I told Rob and I'm gonna join as well because I'm really fascinating. I read his book and I want to see what he has to say. Yusuf Bashir, who is the author of Words of My Father, Love and Pain in Palestine. So that he actually works in Washington, D.C. now and on the Hill. So if you're interested in hearing that conversation, which I'm sure will be fascinating, that's going to happen on Thursday, February 25th, same time at noon. So check that out. You can visit it's a jewishva.org/Israel Today, and you'll have all the information you want there, and register. And yeah, and that's it. I hope to see you all again sometime soon in person or in Zoom. And be safe, everybody. Hold on there. Shalom, shalom, as Mishi says. Good.